Hi, welcome to session 3 of the topic The Idea of Progress in the Making of Modern America. So, this is session 3, and now we're going to look into the third part of the table of contents, which is the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution, which was proposed by a British biologist by the name of Charles Darwin in the 1850s. It was actually written into a book called The Origins of Species. This idea, again, is going to propose that progress was actually one of the laws of nature. Okay, one of the laws of nature. It's called evolution, that is to say. That progress was actually taking place in the world of nature, in everything that is alive, in every living organism, that is to say. Okay, from the smallest organism, whether you want to call it a bacteria, for example, a cell, all the way up to the more complex organisms, such as, for example, amoebas, parasites, the plant kingdom, for example, all of the trees, all of the vegetation, for example. Again, all of those species of plants, including, of course, all living species in the animal kingdom as well. All animals are also, again, subject to this law, and of course, all the way to the human kingdom, that every living organism, again, is evolving. It is, in other words, improving and is progressing. That's what, again, when we look at very closely what evolution actually is, again, it is really something that implies to evolve, that is to progress, that is to say, to move to a higher plane, to a higher order of being, in which, according to Darwin, something we're going to actually explain here, all living organisms are actually adapting to the environment under many types of challenges. And in this adaptation, the organisms that are most suitable, the strongest, the fittest, are going to actually make it again to the next rung. In other words, they're going to be chosen to reproduce by nature. There's a law again that kind of nature chooses the best, the most able, the strongest, the fittest organisms to reproduce, because nature has a sort of intention, again, some sort of plan, and that is that every time an organism reproduces, the next generation has to be more adaptable to the environment, more survivable. It has to be stronger and fitter than the previous ones. Okay? So overall, what Darwin is going to be suggesting again is that everything that is alive, again, is really today the survival of the fittest, in which we have overcome as a species, again, immense obstacles. Our ancestors have overcome intense obstacles, again, in the past, that those that were able to adapt and survive, the strongest and the fittest, were able to pass on their, right now we just call it genes, for example, okay, their traits to their descendants. And through that passing on of those traits, the following generation became far more able, more fit, more strong in the environment to survive, that is to say. So organisms over time are actually becoming more complex, more adaptable, stronger, better, to actually deal with situations in the natural environment, challenges of all types, and so on. And so all living organisms, again, are subject to this law. So even in nature, okay, has progress. In other words, it's not just humans, in the things that we're doing here in our society, trying to improve our economic system, trying to improve our living conditions, trying to improve our knowledge systems, we call science, or tools, technology. It's not just that is advancing and progressing, but also nature as well. So what this theory is going to do Therefore, to the mindsets of millions of Americans in the late 19th century simply confirm their beliefs about progress. Okay, so Americans were already thinking about progress, anyways. In terms of capitalism, in terms of rising up the economic ladder and having a technological, pretty much revolution that will create, the ideal society and so on, a high-tech civilization. That they were moving towards that higher plane, that higher order of being. And when the theory of evolution came, Americans simply used that theory to confirm those beliefs that this was inevitable, that they were on the right track, they were on the right path to progress, that is to say, because this is one of the laws of nature. Okay, nature is actually doing that already, in the natural world, and all living organisms are actually progressing. In other words, so are we. So we Americans, again, are also progressing as well, because we're just, following natural law. Again, we're evolving. We're, through our technological, scientific revolution, our economic revolutions, we're actually helping nature, in other words, in this project to advance the species, in other words, that we're doing nature's bidding, okay? Because this is how, nature works. So we're just doing the work of nature by evolving ourselves into a higher society, in other words. So again, the theory of evolution is going to be instrumental in influencing pretty much how Americans are going to see, on one hand, their own changes, their own revolutions, in other words, and they're creating a high-tech industrial civilization. But at the same time, the theory of evolution is going to influence how Americans are going to see the rest of the world, okay? And how they're going to see other societies that are not following this particular plan, in other words, this particular plan of development. How Americans are going to see non-capitalist, for example, societies, societies that don't follow capitalism, for example, that don't have modern science, that don't have modern technology. The theory of evolution is going to influence, not only Americans, but also Europeans in the way that they're going to be view the rest of the world. Okay, so now let us turn to our slide. And again, this is initiating part 3. And now let's look into the actual theory of evolution. So we have to kind of look at the development of the theory, and then once we do that, then we can actually move into the influence of this theory again upon the thinking of Americans in terms of how they looked at progress, in other words. Okay. All right. So once again, the theory of evolution again pretty much attempts to explain what happens in the world of nature in terms of the living organisms. Okay. In terms of everything that is alive, everything that has life, in other words, what we call, the biological world, that is to say, the world of biology, everything that is alive, that has life. The theory of evolution, again, is trying to explain that those living organisms all over nature actually change over time, and that they're constantly progressing. And this is really a revolutionary idea, by the way. Okay, it was a revolutionary idea back in the 19th century when it was actually written and proposed, because all over the world, it's not just Europe. Okay, so when you look all over the world, I mentioned that all over the world people were following a very religious-based scientific system. Okay. All over the world, whether we're talking about Europe before the scientific revolution, whether we're talking about Africa, the Middle East, Asia, among the Native American societies of the American continent, and so on. Religion was actually used to explain everything, including how the world came into being, how the universe was created, and how every living species was created as well. How was the world created? Who created human beings? Who created the plants and the insects, and the animals, everything? And so all over the world, there's myths and legends that people wrote and transmitted orally as well from generation to generation that indicated that in the beginning of time, the way the world was created is that there was either one God or a series of gods that in the beginning of the world pretty much created the universe and created everything that lives, everything that is alive, that is to say. Okay? They were the makers, the molders, the creators of humanity, and all the human groups as well were created by God or the gods, and all the animals and plants and everything else. Okay? And in the old science, this old religious system of thought that people used to explain creation and to explain the world of biology, the world of living organisms, for the most part, the belief was that everything was created perfectly. Okay, everything was created perfectly. Humans were created according to a divine blueprint. In other words, the way you see humans today is exactly again, how the gods or God created us. In other words, in the beginning of time, and the animals as well, and the plants and the trees. So the way you see nature, they said, is the way the gods created it. It's perfect, and really it has really suffered no change ever since creation. Okay, there's the same, bone structure, the same number of bones, there's the same anatomy, the same physiology in terms of, the organs, and, it's the same structure. Okay, it's exactly this, the way you see a human being, the way you see an animal, is the same thing. Is, there has been no change because this is a very fixed and perfect, if you will, divine design, that the gods or God created. So it has been no change, no alterations, that has occurred over time. So, I mean, this was the kind of like the universal idea, okay, for literally thousands and thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of years, again, since the rise of human societies. This is what people all over the world believe. So at any rate, so this is why the theory of evolution is going to be very revolutionary, because what the theory of evolution was actually proposing in the late 19th century is that there has been significant change that has taken place ever since the world was created. Okay, that actually change occurs in nature. That living species actually mutate over time, and this was something that it contradicted directly, for example, the teachings of Christianity that Europeans and of course North Americans follow so closely. The theory of of evolution that Charles Darwin is going to propose really went against Christianity, because Christians both in Europe and in the U.S. actually use the Bible to explain how the world was created, how humans were created, the first human ancestors, for example, Adam and Eve, and so on and so forth. It was really the Bible that was used as the reference point, to explain creation. Okay, even in academic circles. I'm not just talking about people in church, or in mass, etc. I'm talking about, again, in schools. Schools and colleges, universities, and so on, that existed, for example, in London and France, again, and the advanced centers of higher learning in Europe. It was really the Bible, again, that was used as a reference. Christianity was still pretty much the foundation to explain, for example, the world of biology, how life came to the planet. It was actually a divine intervention. It was God that created life, in other words. Okay? So this is extremely important because, this is how people were educated all people of, that came out of universities, came out of colleges and so on in Europe, or in the US for that matter, when they're coming with those ideas, of course. And in Europe, they even had, in London, scholars actually, proposing the exact day of creation. When was the world actually created? Okay. So in London, in Oxford University, for example, okay, some scholars got together and said, well, if we just study the Bible, okay, if we just go backwards, let's say from the moment of Christ lived about, 2,000 years ago, give and take, back in their time, they were talking about, 1,800 years, into the past. So if you just start counting the years backwards from the moment when Christ was born all the way to the beginning of the Bible, when the world was created, they said, well, if we're going to use the Bible as a reference to actually determine the age of the earth, the age of humanity, and so on, and well, it's actually like about 6,000 years, 6,000 years old. According to those Oxford scholars, the world was created on October 26, 4004 before Christ. In other words, 4,004 years before Christ. In other words, this is when, you start in the Bible, when God created, the universe, let it be light, when created, the world, created the stars, the moon, the planets, the sun, everything, and created the earth, created the waters, created, all the species of animals and plants, and at last humans, that is to say, Adam and Eve. So this is the biblical version, of creation, that there was, of course, a God that created everything, created the animals, created every living organism, and created the first two human beings, the human ancestors, Adam and Eve, that is to say. And once again, as I mentioned, according to Christianity, and according to really world religions, religions worldwide, creation was perfect. The way God or the gods created everything, it was just that everything was created perfectly. In other words, the animals, the birds, everything. In other words, okay, they were so perfect that they were immutable. They were not to mutate or change because they were just the image of God. For example, humans were made in the image of God, for example. Okay, so we're talking about a fixed design, that everything that is alive, everything that has life, is really a fixed design that is perfect, and it has not really suffered change over time in those 6,000 years or so of history, that is to say. Okay, no change. Okay, and so those assumptions are going to be, of course, questioned by Charles Darwin and the people that followed Darwin. Darwin is, again, the father of the theory of evolution. The reason why they're going to challenge the biblical story of Adam and Eve and that God created everything again in the beginning of time, 6,000 years ago, is because, not just because they were just challenging religion, just because they were, scientists, and because they, were atheists, or did not believe in God or anything like that. It was something else. It is that the reason why they're going to challenge the Bible and those stories is because during the 17 and early 1800s, something new was revealed to the world. Okay, that those revelations themselves actually were the ones that challenged the biblical story. Not so much the scientists, but rather there were new revelations about the history of the earth, how old the earth is, in other words, how far back it goes. Okay, is it really 6,000 years old? When this is the moment of creation, when the universe was created. Is it really 6,000 years old? That's how old humanity is as well. Or is there something else that we just don't know, that we haven't taken into account? And that is, again, so those new revelations, again, of the earth's history were the discoveries really of the dinosaurs. I mentioned that really in session one, in the intro. Of the fossils, the bones of the dinosaurs, that is to say. Okay? And the reason why people were for the first time uncovering those remains of creatures that roamed the earth in a distant past that people were not aware of is because, during the 1700s, we see the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Okay? Really, the Industrial Revolution required, certain energy resource to power up the railroads, the factories, the steel plants, and that was coal. Coal was the fuel of the first industrial revolution. When you look back into the 1800s, so people were looking for coal. They were looking for, for that energy resource, and they're digging. Again, there's mining expeditions, mining engineers in charge of those expeditions, trying to search for coal. And in their explorations, they're going to now unearth something about the Earth's past that was totally unknown, to humanity. And again, this is a very dramatic, revelation, by the way, because, everything that humans thought they knew about the world was turned upside down. People have to now come to terms with a new reality. Look, everything that you thought you knew about how the world came into being, the history of the earth, you might probably want to revise that, in other words, because now there is some material, evidence or material, remains of something that goes much farther back than, let's say, 6,000 years ago. Okay, so creation couldn't have possibly taken place 6,000 years ago. It is really, again, based on this material evidence, and this becomes impossible to believe and to uphold, even to defend. When you were trying to defend, for example, that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, it's, in the face of this new evidence, is going to be very difficult. So again, what those mining engineers are going to discover is that as they are digging again into the inner layers of the earth, they're finding, of course, certain very thick, layers of soil chemical composition that is now understood that each layer belongs to a whole period of Earth's history, what we call a geological era. A geological era is a long age of the Earth in which there was specific life forms present during that particular era, if you will. Okay, and as they uncover the remains of those what's called fossils. The fossils are actually the bones, the remains of those organisms, and they piece them together. They're coming across, of course, now this evidence that, look, there's just a lot of creatures that don't look like anything, that we are familiar with today in this world that roam the earth. What happened to those creatures? What happened to them? Were they destroyed in the past by God? Did God realize that those were not useful, life forms, so he destroyed them and then brought new ones? Or what actually happened? Okay, so where they go? Are they totally extinct? We want to understand that, how long ago they lived, and all of that. Okay. And as they start digging deeper and deeper, they find other layers, very thick layers, again, still composed of very different types of soil and chemicals and so on, that belong to a whole different era, okay? A whole different era in which there were other types of living organisms present during that era. And we're talking about, again, that each era spanned for not only thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, but millions of years. In other words, the Earth is millions of years old, in other words. And we're not just talking about several million, we're talking about maybe hundreds of millions again, years old. So it's very old. This is a very old planet, and it has housed so many different life forms, and life forms that have risen and thrived in specific periods of the Earth history. They went through their whole cycle, if you will, but then suddenly those species, for some reason, came to an end, and another era came after that. Again, so this is something that the field of archaeology is going to start doing now. There's going to be now a new field, in science, as a result of those discoveries. The field of archaeology is very similar to the field of history, except that archaeologists are not using written records to study the past. Okay, archaeology also studies the past, but is before the written record. Okay, we're talking about previous societies or existences that left no written record, that is to say, but rather the way you kind of reconstruct the way they live is by studying the soil, the minerals that were present during those lifetimes, those existences, and also studying the remnants, the remains, the bones, for example, of those creatures. So archaeology is trying to make sense of what lived, in the distant past before there were anybody, making a record for us, to read. So again, archaeologists are now pretty much delving deeper into this new field, trying to unearth, the history of the world, the history of the earth, and they're digging, and pretty much finding out what is in each layer, again, of the earth's history. The history of the earth, if you want to really read it, you have to dig, in other words. Okay, you're never going to find it on the surface. If you really want to find out how far we go as a species, or how far the planet goes into the past, how old it is, and so on, all the life forms that have ever appeared on the face of the earth, they're all, the record, that is to say, is all beneath the surface. So archaeologists are the ones that are actually digging, in order to read the record. Okay, read the record of the earth in terms of finding out the eras and how long they spanned, what kind of species was lived. For example, the first layer of organisms are covered by bones that belong to mammals, for example. This is the upper layer, in other words. This is the latest, in other words, layer, the mammals. And then if you start digging deeper, before the mammals, there were the reptilians, the reptiles, that is to say, those were the dinosaurs. There were so many types, again, of reptiles, hundreds and hundreds of different species of reptiles that roamed the earth. And beneath the reptile stage or era, there's, of course, another era, and is the most ancient, perhaps even the first era of the world, is the marine or ocean life forms, the marine life, in other words. So this has led the archaeologists to believe or conclude that life originated in the sea, in other words, in the waters, that is to say. That's where all life forms came from. And why are they saying that? Is because as they were digging deeper and deeper into the Earth's crust, they're just realizing that the very early stages of life on Earth, are actually marine life, in other words. So that's their logical conclusion. Okay, so once again, all the biblical stories that were used in education systems, okay, in Europe and North America, are now confronted with something totally new that is going to turn, once again, biblical stories upside down, because how the Bible is going to explain, for example, the existence of dinosaurs, if the Bible doesn't talk about dinosaurs, for example. Okay, there's no mention of them. or there's no mention that they were, of course, other creatures living in the distant past, millions and millions of years ago. Again, and so the archaeologists and scientists in Europe are going to be now assembling the bones of those creatures and actually exhibiting them on museums. Okay, so this is where a lot of educated people go to. They go to museums and they're amazed, to see this gigantic, massive structures, again, of creatures that once upon a time roamed the earth, and science has, in the early 1800s, in those museums, no labels, no categories to actually indicate what exactly are those types of creatures. Unlike today, for example, now we can actually just say, okay, was a type of dinosaur, a T-Rex, and so on. You can actually have labels and categories and everything today. But back then, I mean, this was a new revelation, so science has not yet developed, the proper term for what this is. What is this? In other words, if you stand just besides it, again, you're going to be overwhelmed about how gigantic this creature was. In other words, in the popular culture in Europe, people will be saying, well, okay, was this like a giant rodent? Okay, like a giant rat. In other words, was this a lizard? And in some circles in Europe, people will be actually claiming that those were actually dragons. Well, maybe what we're looking at here is actually a dragon. The legends of old in Europe, there's all sorts of stories about dragons, and it looks very similar to it again. And so, some Europeans were simply saying, well, now there's confirmation here that the dragons were real. This is another creature that was also pieced, by the archaeologists in Europe, exhibited on those museums, and of course, it does not really belong to anything that we know of, again, in the natural world. When you look back, let's say, the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, when people were visiting those museums, so what is this? Do we have an animal today that looks even remotely close to this? Okay. No. So what exactly is this? Is this a mammal? Is this a reptile, or is it a hybrid, or what is it? What happened to this animal? Why is it that this animal is no longer here? Okay, so those were, of course, questions that the Europeans and even the Americans, of course, American intellectuals and the educated class were confronted with, of course. And the most shocking of all revelations, was not just that there were, creatures that were massive and giant, and living in the past. That was shocking enough. But the most shocking revelation is that there were also different types of human beings. Those were actually definitely humans, but they were very different in their bone structures, than the humans of today. So they do not belong to any of the primates, for example. There were a lot of scientists that were trying to compare the bones of those types of humans that were uncovered in those mining expeditions, comparing them to the bones, let's say, of gorillas or apes and so on, different types of primate. And nothing corresponds. So obviously those were not primates. Those were not apes. So what are those humans? Where they come from? How far ago they lived? What happened to them? Did they become extinct? Were they destroyed? Or are we the descendants of them? In other words, are we related to them somehow? Is that the case? So again, those were called humanoids, human-like. Humanoid is actually human-like. They're not called human fossils because they just don't look like us exactly, but because there's a strong resemblance to us, they're simply called humanoids, that is to say. Okay? And there's so many kinds and so many different types, again, of humanoids that were also unearthed and also exhibited at museums. So obviously, even humanity, goes back in time, millions and millions of years ago into the past. So, why is it that the religions of the world don't talk about this, for example? Is there any mention about this, in the religions of the world? And at this point, I just don't want to, change, of course, the subject, but just as a kind of footnote, it is interesting to note that there are certain religions, again, that talk about this, like the Mayas of Central America, they talk about this. There's even some indication in some of the writings, religious writings, and also the Hindus also in India, of course, also have certain traditions. There have been written stories as well, about, of course, previous, human forms or life forms or races, if you will, they call them, that lived millions and millions of years ago, and so on. So there are a few examples of religions that actually, talk about this, but it's not very well known. But when we talk about, for example, Europe and North America, where Christianity is the dominant religion, there is no room for this because, the Bible simply just don't mention, dinosaurs. They don't mention humans that look different from us, or they don't mention the fact that the earth is much older, that is to say. Okay? But what is certain is that all of those revelations, despite the fact that people just don't have an idea of what all of this means, not yet, when we're talking about, let's say, the 1840s, even 1850s, the mid-19th century, when people are simply overwhelmed by this emerging evidence, of different creatures and so on, that lived millions of years ago, is that despite the fact that they just don't have an answer or an interpretation, is that people are now realizing that change is part of nature, as opposed to how people thought in the past that there has been no change in the world of nature, that everything that appears to us in the world of nature, the living organisms, are the way that the Creator formed them at the beginning of time. Now people are beginning to think about, the possibility that, well, maybe we have suffered significant change, that the plants, the trees, the insects, the animals, humans, that we have mutated, that something has happened along the way that has altered the way we're structured, in other words. Okay? People are beginning to think about time and history in terms of change now. Again, that there has been significant change in the history of the planet. Again, ever since the planet was created and all the life forms appear on this planet, that ever since that moment all the way to today, there's been plenty of change, because look at what we're finding here. We're just uncovering layers and layers of change, evidence that there has been change, in other words. Okay? And so this is very important because, again, now people are thinking about change as opposed to just trying to preserve, what they already know. They're now thinking about discarding, certain ideas, certain beliefs that they previously held as true, and trying to entertain new ones, new ideas that are going to influence their way of looking at the universe. A universe that is actually in flux, in constant change, in other words. Okay? So again, the individual that is going to be credited for actually making sense of all of those revelations of science and what was being exhibited on museums and so on, was actually the biologist, the English biologist Charles Darwin. Okay, he's going to be the one that is going to simply interpret, what was, in front of themselves. What is this? In other words, what are the dinosaurs? What happened in the past that made the dinosaurs actually disappear? Did they really go away, in other words? What happens to those early humans, those humanoids, in other words? Why is it that they're not around anymore? Why is it that we look so different from them? Are we related to them? Or are we a separate creation altogether, different from them altogether? In other words, so what is the connection between us in the present and those previous life forms, in other words? Okay, so again, this is the interpretation, that Charles Darwin is interested in. And in the end, after his observations and field works, he's going to actually write his conclusion in a book in which he's going to pretty much present a new theory, if you will. Okay, a new theory about one of the laws of nature that what he claims is that he suddenly realized or discovered one of the laws of nature, the natural laws, in other words. And that law of nature was the law of evolution. Okay, the law of evolution. So it is really through this what's called theory of evolution that Charles Darwin is attempting to explain how life came into being. In other words, what really, produced life on the planet, and how life has evolved from that moment of creation when it first appeared on the planet all the way to us in the present, in other words. Okay, so once again, what he's actually, his starting point is, why is it that prehistoric creatures no longer exist? Why is it that those dinosaurs, for example, those giant lizards or dragons and so on, whatever they're called, he said, why is it that they're no longer with us? What happened to them? I want to find out. This is his starting point. Okay, so I want to see what caused, in other words, those changes in the past that ended certain life forms and brought new ones, okay, instead. Okay, so his way of understanding that was simply by looking a place in the planet in which he will find wildlife that has not been altered by human interaction or human presence, in other words. So he wants a natural laboratory in which he can actually observe, wild animals pretty much in the wild, the way they behave in nature. And so if Charles Darwin understands the behavior, in other words, of those animals in the wild without any human influence, then maybe he can find out what happens to the animal kingdom. What happens to certain animals, why certain animals die, why other animals live, and so on and so forth. Maybe that can, offer a clue. And he chooses a series of islands, the Galapagos Islands, again, off the west coast of South America, what today is the country of Peru, off the west coast, a few hundred miles. Again, to the west, there's going to be a series of islands in which there's no human settlement there, no human population, and he's going to simply be observing, again, those living organisms. And it is here that he has a glimpse of the theory of evolution when he witnessed one species of animals, it was a bird, what type of bird, in other words, that mutated in different islands, in other words. It's a series of islands. And the same species of birds, again, exist in each one of those islands. Okay? But what he realizes is that this same species had acquired different bodily features or characteristics, in different islands, in other words, because in different islands there were different kinds of predators. Okay, that animal was actually confronted with, and so in order to adapt and survive in a very hostile environment, the same species of bird had to mutate and develop, for example, a larger claws or a bigger beak and so on, that they can actually use to fight or fence off, certain predators, in other words. Okay? So Darwin therefore said, now I understand what is really going on in the world of nature. In the world of nature, we're constantly mutating. Okay? We're constantly mutating according to the environment. Okay? We have to adapt in the environment. And environment, of course, changes, very rapidly. It changes sometimes from place to place, from region to region. So every time certain species of animals move into certain environments, they have to adapt to the soil, to the climate, to the foods, and to the predators, to the other animals that are there also competing for food. And in this adaptation, as a species of animals is trying to survive and adapt, we start to mutate. In other words, we start to adapt to different weathers, to different climates. We start to adapt to different diets and so on. And so in that adaptation, our bodies is really mutating, in other words. It's trying to, to adapt, in other words. Okay, so this, again, is called the common ancestor theory. Okay, the common ancestor theory is simply, again, the idea that species of animals are pretty much have mutated from a common ancestor. So every species of animals, for example, where we talk about bears or birds, where we talk about cattle and so on, that they all have a common ancestor. And all of this diversity that you see in the natural world, the different types of horses or cattle, the different types of bears or dogs or cats and so on, is just the environment. That they all descend from a common ancestor. Okay, all cats go back to the same common ancestor. All dogs come from a common ancestor. But because those species of animals actually separated and went into separate directions of the globe and went to different environments, so as those animals were spreading around the planet, they were actually changing. In other words, their colors, their skin composition, their furs, their defense mechanisms, and so on. So now we got is, just diversity. In other words, you see many types of dogs, but in reality, they all come from a common ancestor. The wolf is the common ancestor of all dogs. Again, but why we see so much diversity again of dogs is because of the environment, the different environments of the planet. The same with birds, in other words. Okay, so again, environmental adaptation has caused biological change. There is a struggle to adapt to the environment, and every time we are confronted with challenges in the environment, our biology mutates and changes, again, in order to conform to those environmental conditions. Okay, so that's exactly what he now thinks about the dinosaurs. That the dinosaurs did not really disappear from the face of the earth. Says they did not disappear. What happened is that they mutated. Something happened in the distant past. He said there was probably a catastrophe, and the environment changed drastically and dramatically at some point when the dinosaurs were present on the earth, that reduced really the food supply again for the dinosaurs. Something happened. Again, we don't know what it is. Maybe a comet, maybe flood. Okay, but what happened is that there was a radical transformation of the environment that reduced the capacity for those dinosaurs to sustain those massive structures. So as the food supply was coming down, there's less and less food. In other words, those dinosaurs needed to adapt to less food. Eat less, in other words. Eat less, little by little. Maybe this process took, many, many years, maybe hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, maybe millions of years. We don't know. But, because there was less and less food available in the environment, now what we got is that those massive structures that were sustained with a lot of food suddenly began to shrink and shrink and shrink over time. and suddenly, they mutated to the way they appear now. He said, the dinosaurs are simply the lizards, the reptiles, the birds, the crocodiles, for example, the iguanas, the chameleons, and so on, that live in the jungle. Those are the heirs of the dinosaurs. In other words, those reptiles that existed millions of years ago, that were massive, that were gigantic, they simply mutated and they became, the reptiles of today. Those are the heirs of the dinosaurs, he said. Okay, so this is a theory about mutation, in other words. Okay, a theory about mutation. But mutation for Darwin doesn't mean that we're actually growing weaker, for example, not because we're shrinking. Okay, not because the dinosaurs were actually shrinking in size from being giants to be so, miniature. Does that mean that those organisms were actually losing certain strength? But on the contrary, what Darwin is saying is that no, they were actually gaining. Okay, they were actually gaining strength. In other words, they were actually gaining strength. They were becoming stronger and fitter, more adaptable, more survivable. That is to say, more survivable. Okay, over time. Okay, so in other words, as we progress, as we evolve, the species that are the ones adapting and surviving are actually passing on their traits, what we call genes, for example, their DNA. They're passing on their traits to their descendants, and what you're actually passing on is your capacity to survive. In other words, your capacity, your strength to actually withstand certain challenges of the environment that allow your ancestors to survive. And this is what you're inheriting every time from your forefathers, from your ancestors. You're inheriting certain capacities, certain traits to actually survive certain environmental conditions, for example, okay, or challenges. Okay, so again, all of this is going to be written in a theory. The theory of evolution, again, is going to be written in a book which he published called The Origins of Species in 1858. Okay, in which he pretty much, outlines the origin of species, where the species originate. In other words, so the species originate in the distant past in the ocean, he said. His idea is that at one point there was no life in the planet, no living organisms of any kind. But when the Earth was finally stable, because it was at one point very unstable, and the temperature was ripe, it was, excellent, if you will, for life to appear, suddenly there was a lightning. A lightning struck the ocean. This bolt of electricity hit the waters, and there were certain chemicals present there. At that moment of creation, that created the first life form. Okay, the first cell. Okay, the first cell. There was a living cell, the first living entity. Again, it was one cell in the ocean, and that cell learned how to split in half, create a copy of itself, and then come together, kind of mate, if you will, create another form, another cell, another organism that was larger, more complex than the original one. And that offspring that was more complex also split in half, made it and created yet another organism that was different, more complex, than the original cells before them, and so on. It's almost like the first cell was like the seed of a tree, or they call it the tree of life. Okay, and so from a seed comes a tree with many, many branches, that is to say, and each branch is a type of species, in other words. So from this original cell came everything. It came, the fish, the algae, and from the sea, certain creatures stepped out of the water, began to roam and adapt on the earth, became the reptiles. Okay, eventually the dinosaurs for millions and millions of years. And then from the dinosaurs, we're going to have, the mammals coming after them. And from the mammals, humans, that is to say. Okay. So again, this took place for millions and millions and millions of years, again, worth of evolution. Again, so life is evolving from simple organisms, from a simple cell, into more complex organisms. Going all the way to our world today, the world of humans, that is to say. Okay, and so what he's actually proposing here is that that nature has intervened in this process again of evolution, making sure that the most able, the strongest, the fittest of the organisms are the ones that are reproducing to pass on the traits to the future generation, that is to say. Okay, so this intervention is called natural selection. Nature selects the most able, the fastest, the most able, the strongest, the fittest of all organisms that are able to survive and withstand all challenges to actually reproduce. Because according to Darwin, nature is interested, in making sure that the next generation of species are more adaptable and more survivable, that is to say. Okay, this is called survival of the fittest, in other words. Okay, survival of the fittest. So this is Darwin's ideas again, that the world was created through a lightning, again creating the first cell, and out of the first cell we got all this multiplicity of different species that have mutated over time through this process of natural selection. Nature always selects, in other words, the strongest, the fittest to reproduce, because ultimately this is leading up to a higher order of being that is going to be more survivable, that all living organisms are moving to this higher, this ideal plane of existence, that we're going to be the most complex, the most intelligent, in other words, life forms, on Earth. That eventually, that's, the project that nature has at hand, in other words, to move everything to a higher order, in other words. Okay, that's, again, evolution. So Americans actually, of course, saw that, as an indication that evolution is taking the place in the world of nature, that nature is evolving, is progressing, in other words, that everything that is alive today is really the survival of the fittest. Okay, we are the survival of the fittest. We are the end point of the evolutionary chain, in other words. So we have made it all this way. In other words, we have mutated. Our ancestors went through so much, stuff, a lot of challenges and so on. But eventually they pass on their traits all the way to us. So we're the most survivable, in other words, okay, up to this point. So this is, again, how people are beginning to think about the theory of evolution in Europe and in the US as well. But there's going to be, of course, certain theories that other intellectuals wrote. In other words, besides Darwin, there's going to be other intellectuals that were pondering on the ideas of Darwin and said, well, if everything is evolving and everything is moving to a higher and higher order of being through this process called survival of the fittest, because that's one of the laws of nature, by the way. Nature is actually doing it. Well, doesn't that really apply also to the human kingdom? That we can actually study humans and actually determine which humans are the most evolved and which humans are less evolved. In other words, that maybe there's a way of actually measuring the evolutionary development of humanity. That not because humanity made it all the way to this point doesn't mean that we're all humans are at the same exact level of evolution. Some people, again, some intellectuals are going to be thinking that maybe there are certain groups, certain societies, certain races of people, or certain nations that are more evolved than others, in other words. Okay, not all humans, in other words, okay, are created equal. Yeah, we're all humans, but what some intellectuals like Herbert Spencer, the sociologist, he's also European, after reading Charles Darwin, he's going to be so convinced that perhaps what is actually taking place here is, that this idea that all humans are created equal is not really scientific, he said. What he proposes instead is that there are differences among human beings that do not necessarily place humans on the same equal level or status or footing, in other words. That some humans deserve to be on a higher order in society, and others on a lower, more subordinated, level in society. In other words, some people are simply superior and deserve to be dominant or leaders, and others, because they're inferior, they deserve to be at the bottom of society, simply following, in other words. So they're supposed to be subordinated to leaders and simply be following, in other words, the leaders, in other words. Okay? So again, this is the ideas of Herbert Spencer. Has nothing to do with Charles Darwin, but Herbert Spencer, the sociologist, is going to simply read Darwin's ideas and create his own interpretation, his own theory. In sociology, it's called social Darwinism. The Darwinism, again, of society, social groups, that is to say, social Darwinism. Again, in which he's really just projecting Darwin's ideas about the survival of the fittest into the human kingdom. That the human kingdom also is governed by the survival of the fittest, in other words. That some humans have inherited from their ancestors superior traits, in other words, superior traits, what we call genes, in other words, while others have inherited inferior ones, in other words. Okay, so those that have inherited the superior traits are the survival of the fittest, while those that inherited the inferior ones are actually at the pretty much at the bottom of the barrel, again, in evolutionary development. They're falling behind, in other words. So what he proposes then is that inside of the human kingdom, you can actually, organize society, in a hierarchical fashion. There's not, in other words, that you can actually look at society and actually very clearly see that there's a hierarchy in society. What is a hierarchy? Simply a ranking system in which some groups are going to be placed on top. They're the dominant, they're the leaders. Others in the middle, they're pretty much, not very, advanced, not very intelligent, not very fit, but they're not inferior necessarily, because below the middle layer, there's of course, the inferior groups that are the less intelligent, the less able, the weakest members of society, in other words, the weakest, whereas the ones on top are the strongest, in other words, they're the leaders, all right? So that's what a hierarchy is, just a ranking, again, of human groups from inferior to middle to superior, if you will, okay? This is in sociology called social stratification. Social stratification is simply, again, dividing society in ranking groups, again, in that fashion I just mentioned, again. In that, again, you can see that in society, in human societies, you can have social classes. For example, in capitalism, he said it's perfectly, again, capitalism is perfect because, capitalism actually, organizes society around social classes. Capitalism has a working class, that's the lower class, has a middle class, and it has an upper class. Okay, he said that's a perfect representation, again, of of this ranking system. He said, that those that are on top in a capitalist society are the survival of the fittest, and those that are on the bottom, they're the weakest, in other words, in society. In other words, the ones that have not risen to the top because of inferior or weaker genes, in other words. The same with races. He said, all of the races of the world can be ranked accordingly. There's a superior race, there's a middle, pretty much intermediate races, and there's, of course, inferior races at the bottom as well. And nations the same way. You look at a multiplicity of different nations around the world, there's going to be superior nations and inferior nations at the same time. So the question remains, how is it that we can actually measure, okay, the development, again, of people? Why do you place certain nations or races or classes on top and others on the bottom. What is your yardstick, in other words, to actually measure people's evolution? He says, well, what Herbert Spencer is actually saying is that technology and wealth, in other words, are the yardstick of evolution. If you want to measure who's the most evolved and less evolved, look at their technology, for example. Okay, so races or nations that have superior technology, modern technology, railroads, electricity, telephones, telegraphs, chemistry, and so on. Those are superior. Okay, so the more advanced your technology is, the more evolved you are, because technology is really an extension of human intelligence. So if you're still using very primitive technology, bows and arrows to go hunting and so on, all of that, you're using animals to transport products. Well, you're below in the ladder, in the hierarchy. You're inferior because obviously you have not yet created modern technology. So the modern nations of the world with modern technologies are superior, he said. And also the wealthy. Okay, the wealthy classes or the wealthy races or the wealthy nations are the most evolved. In other words, there's the survival of the fittest. In other words, okay. So again, this is his own, interpretation. I'm not here endorsing Herbert Spencer's ideas. I'm not even suggesting this is actual science. As a matter of fact, this is not really science. Herbert Spencer's sociological ideas were extremely popular in the U.S. There's no doubt about that. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, very popular. His books were actually used in colleges and universities in sociology classes, by the way. So this is how Americans were actually trained, back during this time. They were trained to think like that, that they were, a hierarchy, of races or nations or groups from inferior to superior. Okay, that this was the scientific way of actually studying society. In other words, but again, it's not really scientific whatsoever. Okay, this is just his own interpretation again of Charles Darwin's ideas. All right, so obviously not all Americans or Europeans for that matter actually embraced the ideas of Charles Darwin or Herbert Spencer about evolution and the survival of the fittest. Okay, not everybody. Okay, this is very, very important to realize. As a matter of fact, there was a backlash. There were some people that actually outright rejected the theory of evolution by Darwin or social Darwinism by Spencer, and those was, of course, the religious communities in both in Europe and the U.S. There was a religious backlash against the theory of evolution. That was centered on a debate was called the creation versus evolution debate. Okay, in other words, what was really debated here is, okay, so was the world really created by a divine being? Right? The way Christianity actually indicates. Okay, this is, the proponents of creation, biblical creation, in other words, that there was a maker, that there was a supreme being, we call it God, etc. That actually formed the world and formed everything that is alive. And on the other end, of course, is, the scientific camp that proposed instead the theory of evolution that says no, that everything has simply been evolving from the ocean, that life came up simply as an accident, a lightning that struck the ocean and brought life and so on, and everything has been evolving after a series of changes, mutations, and so on that has occurred over millions and millions of years. This is called evolution, in other words. So again, this was pretty much the debate that divided Americans and divided Europeans. Were you on the side of science or were you on the side of religion? If you're on the side of religion, you follow the creation story of the Bible. Okay, that was God. God created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and humanity, came from those original ancestors, for example. Or if you were on the scientific camp, you endorsed the ideas of Darwin, saying that we all come from the ocean, from the single cell. In other words, we evolved all the way to this point. And really that divided, American society. And the question was, what should we teach? What should we teach in our children in schools, in science classes? In other words, if you're going to teach science, for example, if you're a teacher in elementary or in high school, etc., what should you teach? Okay, should you teach that we were created by a God, or that we came from the ocean and we're pretty much descendants of the animals and all that? Okay, so what is science? In other words, what is truth? So that was the debate again, what to teach. So what I want just to pretty much conclude here is that really, what actually just in a nutshell, what really was most concerning, at this time regarding the theory of evolution, not only for religious organizations and churches, but really for people that were also skeptical about the theory of evolution, is that, again, this is a couple of points, is that, the criticism, the people that were critical about the theory of evolution, what they were actually saying is that, look, although it's very seductive, this theory, it sounds very sophisticated and all that, what in reality this theory is going to do is that it's going to promote atheism, and is going to, through the promotion of this theory in education, if we educate our future generations under this theory, that in the end we're going to create, a godless civilization. That is to say, because there's no creator here. Okay, there's no maker, there's no supreme being, there's no divinity. So this is a godless, system of thought. In other words, that evolutionary theory proposes. In other words, that everything just came out of accident, and everything is simply evolving, and mutating according to this law called, natural selection, survival of the fittest. So there's no really, maker here that people can actually see that, we came from a divine source. We came from a divine origin, that our origins are divine. In other words, that we're simply just, material, physical organisms and creatures that are here in this planet just evolving, but for what purpose? Okay, what is the whole purpose of that? Just to be fitter and stronger? And that's it. Okay, so in reality, if we allow for the theory of evolution to be taught, on all levels of education, that we're going to create a godless civilization. And what that is going to do, again, is make people feel totally isolated in the world, disconnected, and in a constant state of angst or anguish, in other words, because there's no connection. In other words, we're just simply, parts of a gigantic material universe, this physical machine we call the universe, and there's no connection to something higher. In other words, we're totally isolated in the world. We're going to feel alone. In other words, that there's nothing really overseeing us or taking care of us, guiding our destiny again to become, ultimately something good. The best that we can be in terms of goodness, in other words, that we're going to be totally disconnected from one another as well. And this is going to create the feeling of anxiety, because ultimately, because there's no soul, because there's no God, according to this theory, people are going to fear death more than anything. That is what causes anxiety. Anxiety is when you have deep-rooted beliefs and convictions that there's nothing after death. In other words, that you're just this material body, and after you die, that's the end of your existence. So because death is inevitable, it will come, at any time, that creates anxiety. There's no inner peace felt by people, because we're constantly thinking about, again, the end of existence, which is death, because we're so trapped in materialism and science. And so therefore, again, people are going to simply be in constant anxiety. And number two, and that, again, the theory of evolution, what it's also going to do, according to the critics, is that because we're simply creatures that are in constant competition with ourselves, humans competing with other humans and so on for resources. We're competing for survival. That this is going to actually reduce humans to the animal kingdom. We're going to simply accept that we're simply, animals that have learned how to think. We're nothing more than just soulless animals trying to survive in this environment, and that we're going to simply act like beasts, in other words, because ultimately it's survival of the fittest. So what actually is going to allow for your survival, whatever it is, you have to do, even if that requires, acting cold in towards one another, like cutthroat competition, stumbling upon others and so on and so forth, just to get your way, just to survive. So in other words, that nothing really will separate human behavior from animal behavior. Because more and more, as people accept the theory of evolution, that we're simply trying to survive. So this is a very survival type of theory, that we're simply just trying to survive and do everything that we can in order to just secure survival. Just like animals, in other words. So ultimately, we're just simply going to be acting like beasts, in the future. Okay, so those were actually, the criticisms, in other words, of the theory. So with this, again, we conclude our topic on the idea of progress in the formation of modern America. There will be three key terms, as I explained. The scientific and technological revolutions of the 17 and 1800s, that's one key term, okay? The other key term that will appear the first exam is going to be the rise of capitalism, okay? That we talked about again in session 2. And then in session 3, we just talked about the theory of evolution. That will be the third key term, okay? So this is the end of our discussion. This is the end of this topic. So we have concluded this topic. And so the following topic we're going to initiate again in a couple of days is going to look at the social and economic transformations of the late 19th century. It's going to be a fascinating topic again when we come back. This is all I have for you. Thank you. And I'll see you then in the next session. Thank you.